Halloween is one of the longest running series in film history, with really only James Bond and Godzilla competing with the cultural longevity held by a spray-painted William Shatner mask on a mute killing machine. With the release of Halloween, not to be confused with Halloween or Halloween, Halloween's 40-year anniversary is marked with the biggest financial success in the series run, a David Gordon Green Halloween, if you will. And after seeing it in theaters, I decided to revisit the franchise, whose creator wishes it had died after the first film. So I watched 10 films featuring the same villain and one other one over the course of about 6 days, and now that my brain has reverted from mush back to solid-ish, I'd like to talk about every single one of them, starting out, of course, with where the franchise started. I don't think it's possible to talk about the majority of these without referring to where they continue from previous films, so I'm going to issue a blanket spoiler alert from the get-go. I don't think spoilers will inhibit your experience for any of these films, but for those who like watching with fresh eyes, there's your warning. I'll also include timestamps in the description if you want to skip around. Alright, let's go. John Carpenter has long been a favorite director of mine, even if many of his films were released before I was. 7 of them, Assault on Precinct 13, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness, and They Live, all make for some of my most rewatched and most enjoyed, with The Thing easily being in my top 10 of all time.
Mac wants the flamethrower.
Mac wants the what?
That's what he said, now move!
Damn it.
And yet, for several years, I didn't quite understand why Halloween was so heralded. I first saw this film when I was 16, so the Rob Zombie remakes had already been out for a few years at that point, and it's not like I watched it with the fresh eyes of the era it was released in. To me, it seemed like just another slasher flick. In the years since, rewatching, reevaluating, and learning a bit more about the film has caused a dramatic change in my opinion. Halloween, with some help from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is to slasher films what Die Hard is to action films. It has been so influential in its style and execution that I thought it was just another dime a dozen movie in the genre it practically invented. So many filmmakers have aped it over time that if you were to watch some 80s slashers like Friday the 13th, which is what happened to me, you might think it's just a lower budget version of those films. And yet it really isn't. The opening sequence is a masterclass in how to gotcha an audience, and it uses a first-person camera angle to make you feel almost dirty for watching such a gruesome act take place, even if the effects are a little dated. This would later be aped by Friday the 13th, and more recently in the 2011 remake of Maniac. The acting in Halloween has held up surprisingly well, considering many horror films in this era suffer from being a bit campy even at their best, and the music alone makes for a sense of dread and anxiety that few films can achieve. The theme is so iconic and honestly saturated at this point that it can elicit a laugh when it's used in later installments, but never has it been more intimidating than when it's featured in the original. The simple pulsating of the percussion and unusual time signature featured in Carpenter's score gives a calculation to Myers' actions that likely wouldn't have translated as well in its absence, and it pulls a lot of the legwork in keeping the movie frightening. Carpenter's even bigger strength is knowing when to let the music be absent, like in this shot of Michael watching Laurie, which perfectly encapsulates one of the most unnerving things a director can do in a horror film: make broad daylight scary. Michael's breathing also doesn't help. All of the characters feel fairly well defined, with Loomis and Laurie as the standouts in this department, a logical outcome considering they're our main characters. Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis steal the show without even trying, with Pleasance's no-nonsense portrayal reflecting a certainty of Michael's pure evil, and Curtis's mixture of terror and survival instinct playing perfectly off of her unassuming demeanor when she's first introduced, to make her into not only the first, but one of the most believable final girls in slasher films. The screenplay, co-written by Carpenter with Deborah Hill, his producer and a huge creative force in a lot of his work, makes for a perfectly lean hour and a half. There's not an ounce of fat on this film's script, with every single scene either informing a character's motivation and personality or furthering Myers' escalating descent onto the quiet town of Haddonfield that Halloween night. The film is surprisingly absent from not only gore, but also from proper jump scares as we now know them, where characters can be surprised without the sound of a kitchen overhang falling into an open piano.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
Jesus.
Are you all right? I didn't mean to startle you.
This one is a classic for good reason, and even if certain elements of it haven't aged the most gracefully, it's not difficult to see why so many love this film, myself included. Its ending would have made for a perfect conclusion to a franchise that then would have never existed, and if you wanted to dead stop at this one, I would not blame you. It's the best in the franchise so far by default, but a small spoiler for the rest of this video, it's never gonna move from this spot. Simple, effective, well executed, and just plain fun, Halloween is a wonderful group watch movie for that holiday that isn't coming for like a full year. 3 years later, Carpenter and Hill returned to write a direct sequel, again featuring Laurie and Loomis and taking place the same night despite the gap between releases. Luckily, neither of the actors aged a day, so it worked out nicely. The sequel's a bit more of a traditional slasher as we know them now, featuring significantly bloodier kills than the first film and a heavy penchant for showing most of the violence. Carpenter has stated this was a direct result of the successes of other films that had come out since the original, namely Friday the 13th, but likely including Terror Train and He Knows You're Alone, which is basically a remake of Halloween, but with Tom Hanks, of all people. To me, having a creative person feel like they need to compete with films that are tremendously inspired by their work is a depressing reality we've still never managed to escape, but I digress. At the time of release, many criticisms lobbied at the film were rooted in this increased goriness, so perhaps it's just my more modern standard, having watched things like Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, the Evil Dead remake, the Hostel films, and, unfortunately, the Human Centipede series, that makes this film still seem incredibly tame, but that tameness holds up even when held next to the films Carpenter said he was competing with. Provided it's shown on screen, pretty much every kill in the Friday the 13th series is gorier than anything you're gonna see in this one. Couple all of this with the fact that the best death scene in the movie is shot out of focus, and it makes it a bit difficult to understand where the criticism was lobbied. Yeah, there's some gory stuff in other places, like right after the out of focus death where a girl's face gets melted, but it's relatively tasteful for the most part. Relatively. And at this point, I should probably start talking about the actual film instead of the response surrounding it. Curtis and Pleasance are both great again, although Curtis unfortunately has a lot less to do this time around since she spends half of the film either freaked out or sleeping. She seems to calm down considerably with the introduction of Jimmy, a hospital worker who should not be in this film because he sucks, and Lance Guest has no chemistry with Curtis. The tone starts off a little odd too, with an unintentionally comical death scene for a person who is obviously not Michael but is clearly meant to be Michael, since it happened so early in the film. But it's meant to be taken seriously, and it gets a lot weirder when you find out later that the person killed was a drunk teenager, and the film just kinda leaves that plot thread to hang. That said, one of the best moments in the film is Loomis in the morgue when the body can't be identified and the cops actually take him seriously and immediately start looking for Myers. Also, Loomis threatens to shoot a marshal if he doesn't turn his car around, which is pretty much peak Loomis craziness in this series. However, he only reaches this level of desperation once the reveal happens. If you've seen this movie or the majority of the subsequent entries in this series, you already know what I'm referring to. I think the real reason this entry gets so much flack, at least nowadays, is due to the revelation that Laurie is actually Michael's sister, and that was his motive for trying to kill her in the first film. It retroactively makes the first installment a fair bit less scary, almost like if The Strangers Pray at Night had revealed that the intruders killed Liv Tyler because she'd given one of them up for adoption or something, and not just, as they say in that movie, because they were home. But good news, I skipped ahead, and there's a lot of great stuff before that. Rick Rosenthal's direction throughout, while a bit more flashy than Carpenter's, provides the film with some delightfully creepy shots and some excellent misdirection, with a notable example involving the recurring use of a hospital bed light. Make no mistake, there's some goofy stuff in here too, but I still surprisingly enjoy it. Maybe that's got something to do with expectation when I first saw it, but even upon revisiting it, I found a lot to like. This is definitely underappreciated in the grand scheme of sequels, especially slasher sequels, despite its imperfections and a nearly film-ruining plot twist. While I said this about the previous film, I actually think the ending of Halloween 2 makes for the strongest outpoint the series has ever attempted, and it has attempted an outpoint several times. Allowing Loomis to sacrifice himself to bring the one evil that's haunted him for decades to an end is a pretty great way to wrap up the character, and leaves a satisfying feeling that Laurie will be okay, if a little fucked up for a while. Obviously, this one falls under the original, but I do find it to be among the best the series has to offer. This was originally meant to be the end of Laurie and Michael's story, and Carpenter and Hill wanted to turn Halloween into an anthology series, a feature-length Twilight Zone or multi-installment Trick or Treat for comparison. And for a whole one movie, they got to do that.
Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch.
Halloween 3 is really, really weird, and it's probably the installment I have the most to say about. I think I might love it, even though there is a whole lot wrong with it, primarily in its pacing and its storyline, which are two pretty big factors of a film that make it good or bad for me. Yet the sheer weirdness factor gives it a ton of charm and even more entertainment value. The opening sequence honestly makes for one of the best scenes in the franchise, especially because Carpenter stayed on to do the music for this one, but without using the Shape's theme. No spooky piano this time, we just get a completely original Carpenter score, and unsurprisingly, it's the highlight of the film. This sequence establishes a sense of mystery immediately, especially when you have nothing to go on. It almost feels like you're watching a sequel to a film that doesn't exist, or, and I mean this as a compliment, the opening of a really good Doctor Who or Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode. Who are the men in suits, and why are they consistently filmed much like Michael Myers? It's a clever little way to build suspense, invoking such an iconic presentation of a villain on these weirdo suit men. However, this sequence is also the first area where pacing comes in as an issue, since it smashes from the guy being hunted down to some nuclear family. This family's patriarch, Dr. Chalice, played by Carpenter mainstay Tom Atkins, who I love by the way, is actually the main character of the film, but it's a bizarre break on the momentum the opening built to introduce someone whose primary character trait is being a doctor so abruptly. But this awkward cut introduces us to the best commercial jingle of all time.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
It's kind of cheating because it's literally just London Bridge is falling down, but I'm amazed this isn't considered one of the more iconic pieces of music from this franchise or from a horror film in general. Seldom can a song go from being adorably catchy and naturally grow into feeling sinister, but this one does it. Unfortunately, there are things in this film other than the Silver Shamrock theme song, and those add up to an absurdly mixed bag. On the positive side, one of my favorite deaths in the series comes from this one, which almost seems like it's going to be identical to the wonderful eye pop kill from Friday the 13th Part 3, but ends up being simultaneously more and less cartoony. Atkins elevates his thin role as he always does and makes for a pretty entertaining protagonist even when the film gets boring, which, on the more negative side, it does often. A critical culprit of this waning interest comes from Ellie, the daughter of the man from the opening sequence. The film joins them on a DIY investigative journey where they find all kinds of weird stuff, least of all the Kupfer family and an off-kilter town near the Silver Shamrock factory, but their relationship never really has any spark or chemistry to it, making their sudden romantic involvement about halfway through baffling at best and horribly uncomfortable at worst. I think the script can be blamed for this, as everyone just kind of does things because a story has to happen, and while Ellie's motive to find her dad's killer makes sense because he's her dad, Chalice has virtually no agency to be doing this. Despite these and other flaws, the film has a strange aura to it that intrigued me to the point that even during scenes where my mind was drifting away from the actual events occurring, I was still invested in what they were leading to. A lot of that can be attributed to the repetition of the Silver Shamrock commercial, or just random weird bits like the original Halloween playing not once but twice, in what I would call an unnecessary meta element that somehow made my ears perk up both times. With main antagonist and Silver Shamrock owner Connell Cochran not appearing until 45 minutes in, and played with a scenery-chewing, mustache-twirling menace by Dan O'Herlihy no less, he brings an almost L. Ron Hubbard presence to the otherwise head-scratching motives of Silver Shamrock, talking to his employees and customers like he runs a Walmart that fronts an abduction ring. Although some unintentionally funny line delivery threatens the cult-like mood at the factory.
What final process?
Don't ask me.
I've seen this movie like 5 times and I still don't know if that was an intentional joke. The men in suits turn out to be androids, which is fine, I guess. I don't know. It's fine. Perhaps the biggest criticism levied at this film over the years, other than the obvious where Michael Myers go, is how all these masks contain small fragments of a stolen pillar of Stonehenge that apparently has an energy that can not only destroy faces as seen earlier, but can also somehow be triggered in the back of a mask by a flashing pumpkin on a television screen. They lampshade the absurdity with a wink-wink line, but it doesn't really stop you from cocking your head.
We had a time getting it here. You wouldn't believe how we did it.
I strongly suspect I would not believe how you got it here. I don't know what the hell writer-director Tommy Lee Wallace was thinking when stealing Stonehenge was his best idea for plot development, but this all leads up to a scene with the Kupfers watching the Silver Shamrock Halloween special that is nothing short of jaw-dropping. The Jingle has been promising a TV special that all the children should watch, and their son puts on his shamrock mask as requested. The special is a flashing pumpkin, which proceeds to seemingly melt the brain of little Buddy Kupfer before snakes and insects crawl out of his corpse and kill his parents. Not necessarily all for good reasons, but seeing a child's brain vaporize and snakes come out of his body to eat his parents is just... it's amazing. With both the threat and a ticking clock element established, Chalice has about an hour and a half before the commercial airs and kills countless children and their families this way. It just makes you wish they had almost any other explanation apart from Stonehenge energy. And the film decides to keep fighting itself with more goofy shit, like having Ellie secretly be an android even though she doesn't act anything like any of the other ones and would have theoretically had to have been made in like 20 minutes, but I don't want to resort to nitpicking. There's enough wrong with this without me nitpicking. A clunky and frankly lame fight scene with Chalice serves as an unneeded stalling to slow him down from getting the commercial off the air, which he does for 2 stations by calling the program director of all television, and this one dude gets it pulled off of 2 of the 3. I'm trying not to nitpick, but even with the conflicting intelligence of the decisions being made and the tones all working against each other, the finale all but guarantees the horrific deaths of thousands of people because of a flashing pumpkin, and that's a haunting way to cut to credits, even if it seems a little preemptive. A part of me wishes there had been shots of children watching the commercial, similar to how Chalice's children at the start of the film were watching it, but not showing any of them dying just yet, with just his shouting overlapping it. I don't know, I don't have that much footage to work with, but I feel like that could have been fun. This one takes third, and you might be noticing a pattern here, but I think it might actually be the most interesting film in the series, original included, purely on the back of its strange and sometimes bad decision-making and execution. It was an original idea for a film franchise that just didn't pan out, and it's not exactly difficult to see why. Now's a good time for a reminder that original does not mean good, but in this case, I honestly think this one's got more good than bad. And I wish Carpenter and Hill had gotten to expand on their anthology idea and let some more directors come in and try to do something new with the series. But...
Wake me up! I can't wake up! Save me!
Surprising exactly 12 people, Halloween 3 didn't slay at the box office, and people were very grouchy that Michael Myers wasn't back. So series producer Mustafa Akkad decided to bring him and Loomis 6 feet above and let them duke it out yet again. No Jamie Lee Curtis this time, as she was busy starring in A Fish Called Wanda and otherwise progressing her career, so Laurie gets an unceremonious off-screen car crash as a cause of death, and orphans a daughter, Jamie Lloyd, who is now our main protagonist. Jamie's main character trait early on is that she feels like a burden to her adopted sister Rachel, and Rachel's main character trait is telling Jamie that she's not a burden, even though she is. Now, for those of you who remember a few minutes ago when I showed you the ending of Halloween 2, the franchise is saying that Loomis and Myers survived this. If you wanted to say Michael came back from that, I guess I wouldn't be completely opposed to it, but Loomis is a human man and has a face scar that makes Harry Osborn's bomb injury in Spider-Man 3 look incredibly accurate to the damage he took. But, you know, the guard at the beginning says this.
But his doctor, of all people, shot him 6 times. Then he set him on fire. Both of them nearly burned to death.
So that totally explains it. Explains it about as well as how I wouldn't believe how they got Stonehenge here. This is the first film in the franchise to not have any input creatively from Carpenter or Hill, and it shows quickly with just the music. Alan Howarth, a composer who received an odd in association with credit for scoring the previous 2 films, does this one solo, and it immediately makes a lot of sense why Carpenter seemed to want him credited as more of a helping hand than a proper co-composer. The signature theme in the first 2 films is always used for one of 3 purposes: the opening title sequence, Michael's looming presence, or the inevitability of death at Michael's hands. The first time we hear those iconic notes, and the first time theatergoers had heard them in 7 years, is when Michael is being taken out on a gurney. Then the music stops just before he starts killing people by putting his thumb into a man's forehead. Isn't there bone in your forehead? Whatever, Michael's free again, and now we find out that Jamie is having visions of Michael despite never having met or seen him, and we learn this through 2 poorly executed dream sequence fake-outs. The main purpose of these, I think, is to show the audience how the mask manages to, beyond all odds, look infinitely worse than it did in the first 2 films. This seems like it should not even be possible, given how the mask was made, and yet, look at it. These dream sequences actually set up a pretty nice moment at a storefront later where Jamie thinks she's having a dream, but the filmmaking shows us Michael was actually about to kill her. But Jamie comes out as one of the bigger problems this movie has for most of its runtime. The idea of having a new Myers relative in the bloodline and Michael getting out to hunt her is fine enough for a 4th movie in a franchise, I guess, but Danielle Harris, like most children who are hired to act in professional film productions, is not very good at professionally acting. They give her a lot of dialogue with a variety of emotions, and a lot of them come out sounding kinda like this.
She wants to go out tonight. It's my fault you can't.
That wizard came from the moon.
It's distracting, and it takes away from a lot of scenes that focus on her. As much as I don't like the idea of Loomis surviving out of pure principle, Donald Pleasance does come in and threaten to make this movie interesting. Somehow the writing for his character has barely missed a beat, despite a total of 4 writers working on this script at any given point, and none of them being Carpenter or Hill, at least according to the credits. He instantly moves to find Michael when the mere chance of his survival is mentioned, and he has one of my favorite snarky lines in the character's history in this one.
If you don't find him in 4 hours, I'm sure I will.
But then the movie has to return to children and give me more reasons to get a vasectomy than the long list I already possess. Children, as a general rule, are kind of bad for horror films, and I don't understand why filmmakers to this day insist that they aren't. You've got to really work hard to make kids not ruin your movie, and we did not have that down yet. I've also just realized that this series basically does the exact same thing that the Star Wars franchise does that I hate. Everyone is related to each other somehow, or they were at a historic event, or they worked with someone who was in the previous films. Even though Myers is painted as this random killing machine in the first one, and even the second to a lesser degree, he always manages to somehow know about and find these people who are directly or even loosely related to him, track them down like he has an internal white pages, and kill pretty much everyone in their vicinity that isn't actually them, because he kinda sucks more at killing with each passing movie. If you've seen Friday the 13th Part 2, the first one with Jason in it, you know that he's honestly a terrible mass murderer in that movie and basically racks up a body count out of sheer luck. He gets the shit kicked out of him repeatedly, and it's a miracle he gets anything done, let alone murdering people. Now, as that series goes on, Jason gets to the point of near invincibility, a logical progression for a nearly characterless character to grow stronger and get better at something with repeat outings. Yet somehow, every time Michael goes out to kill people, he screws up more and more like he's losing his mojo.
I've lost my mojo!
There is a scene in this film where 3 people are dressed up as Michael, and all of their costumes look better than the real one, and that scene is more intimidating than almost any of the scenes that actually feature him. I'm not talking about the plot much because it's just Halloween again, but made a bit worse. They have the door impaling, but with a gun instead of a knife, which looks weird. Michael still gets shots focusing on him walking with purpose, even though he looks kind of bored in this one. Michael kills the dog again. And in the biggest ripoff of the original movie, Michael comes out from underneath a pickup truck like a Cirque du Soleil performer and starts stealthily killing people despite being in like a 5-foot area. Just like that scene in the first one. You remember? This is the best part of the movie, and the only reason I still kind of recommend it, because it is so unintentionally funny watching Michael just sliding around on top of a truck and having the otherwise freaked out Rachel push a corpse out of a moving car. And then Michael does this. I don't know if this makes other people laugh, but I laugh every time I see it, probably including when I'm editing this right now. I can't help but smile. It's so great. Him getting shot a million times and clumsily falling down a mine shaft is also pretty amazing.
Get down!
And at this point, I was prepped for the series to divert into complete schlock. but this movie just had to do something incredibly interesting at the end and make Jamie stab her mom. Suddenly this goes from the goofy shit to Donald Pleasance screaming and crying, distraught over seeing the same evil in Jamie that he saw in Michael as she holds a knife covered in the blood of a loved one, and he tries to shoot her. Seriously, this ending is so good, and I could not wait for them to go full insane, actually kill Michael once and for all, and make this seemingly innocent girl a serial killer. Have Donald Pleasance need to hunt down a child because of her mass murdering. That is an interesting direction to take a 5th movie in a franchise. But obviously, 4th place, a lot of this is kind of boring and bad.
I make fart noises with my mouth.
They did not kill Michael once and for all. They did not make this seemingly innocent girl a serial killer. Those 2 thoughts could almost be my entire review of this film, but I like the sound of my own voice, so I'm going to elaborate a whole bunch. Harris's performance is a lot better now that they decided not to let her talk, which would have been a great benefit if she had been murdering people, and her seemingly physical link to Michael pokes at the idea that this might be going where you wanted it to, but nope. Also, we'll get this out of the way early, but Halloween 5's mask manages to look worse than the 4th one, although I suppose the completely unnecessary year he spends in comatose 200 feet downriver in a hermit's shack could really get some wear and tear on that mask. I feel like this film almost could have been saved if they doubled down on the soft remake nature of Halloween 4 and having 5 just be 2 again. Have Michael get up and keep hunting Jamie on that same Halloween night. But instead he sleeps for a year and is presumably fed and changed by this homeless man, which is honestly a movie I would watch over this one, before reanimating on Halloween, of course, and killing the guy. This poor hermit is the most sympathetic character in all of these films. A guy with almost nothing, still spending time to save the life of a man he can't even speak to and who tried to kill him when they first met. He doesn't even get a cool death for his troubles, so now I feel bad for the actor too. No one remembers this hermit, and it's a shame. Also a shame is that Jamie's mom survived, we're told, but she never actually comes on screen again, so that just takes a huge plot development and ruins it. And this repeats with Rachel, who's actually one of the better characters in the 4th film, even though I barely mentioned her, getting killed like she wasn't already in one of these movies. She dies so early in the movie, and it is flabbergasting that no one notices for, presumably, several hours where she was meant to be doing other things. Instead of her, we get Tina, a surrogate for Rachel, who is apparently close with both her and Jamie. And Tina is written like if Rachel was in a later Friday the 13th movie. She sees someone lurking several times and does not call out any names or acknowledge it, the way most people do not only in movies but in real life. Every single decision she makes is so painfully stupid you kinda want her to die, and the film at least manages to deliver on that. And since with Tina we've got Rachel Light, unfortunately Loomis comes back and he's kind of Loomis Light. He's saying the same things, but slightly louder, and I realize I might be sick of it because I watched all of these so close together, but he turns into a character that seems almost as scary as Michael. His desperation resorting to hysteria when he starts bullying Jamie to help him find Michael. Apparently, Pleasance shared the opinion of myself and many others that Jamie should have been the antagonist in this film, and I can't help but wonder if he might have phoned in his performance a little bit as a result. Not that the script does him or anyone else any favors. There are 2 cops that pop up a few times throughout the film that have their own theme music.
All clear. Nothing above, nothing below.
This is terrible, and for those of you who have seen Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, you probably feel like you're watching someone commit plagiarism, because you kind of are. I'm sure the official explanation is that it's a reference, but even if that was the case, why in the fuck would any director want to bring memories of the Last House on the Left cops into their horror movie? I think Last House on the Left is a decent enough movie that is painfully stuck in its time and painfully limited by its budget, but the worst element, without question, is those police officers. This is not something you want to reference in your serious movie. This is something you would make fun of in a parody. It's just another in a long line of endless writing and editing decisions that don't work at all, and there aren't a whole lot of bad, funny things to keep you enjoying it otherwise. Although Michael does chase people by driving a car and a woman rips a pitchfork out of her boyfriend's back, so those are kind of fun. But then the movie accidentally has a good, tension-filled scene. The mask! Oh, this mask, dude, it's so bad. The fucking car horn shuts off and I'm in it. And I'm like, oh, that's spooky. And then he gets out and the mask looks like that. No, go back in the car, you're ruining it. Look at it. Look at the mask. It looks, that scene was good. Why do you have to wear that mask? Loomis at least gets to go even more crazy in this movie, which does return some pretty great results. I'm also pretty sure he has selective memory about the second film, much like this one does.
Can you kill him?
Think so.
I wish he had been given free reign to go completely bananas, but we never quite reached that point. Anyway, Loomis gets Michael by tranquilizing and beating the shit out of him with a plank, but a strange black-suited cowboy man murders an entire police station of officers and breaks Michael out, with Jamie now breaking down like Loomis did last time. I wish there was more setup to that, but there isn't. It just happens. Like, the man in black doesn't show up earlier. It's just some cowboy guy who pops up at the end and shoots a bunch of police officers. A lot of this speaks for itself, to be honest. I tried really hard not to just do a this happens, then this happens rundown, but there's almost nothing else to get out of this. This is the first Halloween movie I would say I actually dislike, maybe hate. There's not enough dumb, funny stuff to make it reach so bad it's good, but there's also not enough regular good stuff to stay unironically interested in it. Loomis's unbridled and ever-escalating insanity is kinda great and culminates in an unintentionally hilarious finale, but then we get stuff that's just set up for the next movie, like Michael's wrist tattoo that looks like a tongue sticking out face. This sudden and previously unseen tattoo is also the first sign of the worst plot development in the entire franchise, until we get to Rob Zombie, don't you worry. But that doesn't come until the 6th movie, which didn't come out for 6 years. But unfortunately for me, I watched it about 6 minutes later. This is in 5th, so we're still in chronological order for the ranking, but we've got 6 more to go.
Money, 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 motherfucker.
Okay, so I have been trying really hard to say positive things about these movies at any given opportunity. There was a point in the last year or so where my inherent cynicism towards a lot of movie practices, including but not limited to unnecessary sequels, reboots, prequels, and remakes, completely changed, and I think I've accepted them mostly because sometimes they're quite good, and even if they're not, they've gotten progressively easier to write off. I watched the 2016 Ghostbusters film, and I didn't laugh once, so I never watched it again. People liked it, that's cool with me, but I'll stick to the original. If you like a remake or a sequel, I don't see a problem with that, and if a sequel retroactively adds something in that you don't like, I don't see how you can't go back and just watch that movie like it didn't happen, like I choose to do with the first Halloween film. With all that said, I don't think it's too much to say that I am very unhappy that this movie exists. There are a few things in it that I like, primarily the fact that Paul Rudd is in it as an older version of Tommy Doyle, one of the kids Laurie babysat, who has been obsessed with Michael Myers for no real reason since that first night. His performance is unintentionally hilarious, and it's just because he's Paul Rudd. Paul Rudd is an incredibly charming and goofy guy, and while he's definitely a good actor, it's hard to take him seriously when he was very much miscast in the role of a creepy, socially awkward serial killer obsessive. As much as this is definitely enjoyable, less enjoyable is the reveal that Jamie and Michael were captured by the Deus Ex Machina at the end of 5, and Jamie was, raped and impregnated while in this cult compound. And considering she was meant to be about 8 in the 4th film, that puts her around 15 in this one. This seems like something that would be a very horrific element to have in your horror film, but honestly, it's just kind of a thing that isn't acknowledged or made into a huge deal. So that's weird. The fact that there's yet another offspring in the Myers bloodline is the bigger deal, so I guess we're just gonna focus on that. She gets a pretty fun death, and that's barely even a spoiler because she dies like 20 minutes in, and it's kind of insulting to have her die that easily and that early. After those 20 minutes, the whole thing just becomes about Paul Rudd and her baby, making us now at Laurie's granddaughter and also her extended family, who helped Paul Rudd along with the clearly too old for this shit Loomis. The first kill of this movie is yet another redo of the iconic wall stab from the first film, even with the signature head tilt, and as much as I love this kill, I'm done with it. To praise something at least, this version of the theme song is probably one of the best updated versions in the series, but the same cannot be said for the rock version. I mean, I guess 1 out of 2 ain't bad. I'm struggling with where to start with this and how to even structure talking about this movie. It's pretty much just rambling. The Curse of Michael Myers just makes me really tired. Jamie looks nothing like Danielle Harris anymore, so it doesn't even feel like she's the same character, which maybe explains why they kill her so fast. We have Loomis to connect with, who actually seems happy at the beginning, smiling and seemingly having moved on with his life for the first time in the series. Much like the franchise as a whole, you kind of just want him and Pleasance to pack it in and enjoy retirement. The law of diminishing returns is in full effect here. Even Pleasance's performance has trouble extracting any joy out of this one. Paul Rudd makes his scenes feel like they should be in another hackneyed scary movie sequel, even though he's taking it seriously for the most part.
Oh, shit.
People consistently miss obvious things like a massive trail of blood leading to a hidden starving baby in a cabinet in a public place. Like I said, I'm trying not to nitpick these, but I don't feel like something that egregious is even considered a nitpick. Paul Rudd also figures out that the tattoo on Michael's wrist is a sign of thorn, which has never been there before, and the Tommy character was only in the first film. I don't even know, man. I guess the mask looks okay. That's something. The father is such a comically evil character that he might as well have started the film off dead with where he goes. The series has never particularly thrived on the film-to-film character work, with very few exceptions, but this one is where all the archetypes really come out in full swing. The bright side is they use him to provide a genuinely great death. Head explosions are woefully underutilized in films in general, and this is a pretty good one, even if it makes the second time that people being thrown into electrical objects has been made hilarious. A lot of this stuff is edited like a Saw film though, and it hurts my eyes, and of course this one explains how Michael is so powerful. The tattoo on his wrist is a sign of thorn, so Tommy's right on his first guess, which apparently gets marked on one kid from the cult that they're in, and they have to kill one of their family members on Halloween night, except they say it was for the Festival of Samhain because that's marginally less silly sounding. So now he's invincible and is trying to kill Jamie's son because he needs a Halloween sacrifice to stay invulnerable. So Michael Myers' motivation in this entire series has been continued invulnerability, but if he only needs to sacrifice one person on Halloween, why did he kill 16 people on Halloween? This is all stupid and bad, and I'm just kind of done. I think we're done. I'm gonna wrap it up. Maybe 2 good deaths, and the amusement of seeing Paul Rudd in these dumpster fires can't quite offset just how bad the rest of it is. The cult stuff absolutely does not work here, and I say that as a huge defender of using cults and paganism in films. A ton of my favorite movies have those elements in them, and I think they're generally great, but the entire intrigue of Michael Myers, as I've already said, is that he just does. He doesn't think, he doesn't feel, he does. It's kind of worth seeing Paul Rudd beat Michael with a pipe repeatedly before the editor completely spazzed out on the timeline, but I'm just going to show you that here. There, you've seen pretty much the only thing that's worthwhile for watching in Halloween 6. Perhaps this movie's biggest offense, including explaining Michael's power source, is leaving Loomis and Michael's fates both completely open-ended in the conclusion. It's just a mask on a floor, and then you hear Loomis yell. To be fair to the filmmakers, they may have planned to make another one with Pleasance to explain what happened with Loomis, or maybe they had to rework an ending that they weren't able to get him to film because, perhaps most sadly, this was not only Donald Pleasance's last film in the franchise, but one of his last ever before his passing early in 1995. He didn't even get to see the finished film, not that I think he'd be terribly proud of it, but still. For good measure, I looked up the ending of the producer's cut, and in this one, Michael takes off his mask to reveal that it's Dr. Wynn, who was also the Man in Black. And so he then puts the mark on Loomis and starts yelling, and then Michael is dressed as the Man in Black and he leaves. This is worse. Okay, apparently a bunch of people prefer the producer's cut, but this ending is way worse. You know, this isn't the real ending. I'm not gonna waste any more brain power on it. They're both awful. It's admittedly missing the wonderful line of
Power of the Runes stopped him,
but not really worth it. Despite these 2 terrible endings, I kinda wished Loomis could have come back. Obviously not possible because you're not gonna recast Donald Pleasance in this series. And his absence is extremely notable once we reach H40 or H20 or Halloween H2O 20 years later, subtitle Halloween 7, whatever it's called, the 7th one in the franchise. This one smartly opts to forget every single film after 2. That is right, we are entering our second reboot of the franchise only 10 years later, and only 3 years after the previous installment. Good thing that never ever happens anymore, where people reboot franchises super quickly when one does kinda poorly. And another good thing is people never come back to YouTube just to split their return video into 2 parts.